Cody, you're muted.
Thanks, Britta. Sorry about that. I am going to talk about the headaches of tree plantings, but really it's more of a tree planting 101 today, but there are a lot of headaches involved in that. So before we jump into that, I'll just run through our typical introduction here. Part of the CRP myth busting series. I'm Cody Tromberg. I'm a senior biologist with Pheasants Forever, and I cover the 5 counties along the St. Croix River. My favorite CRP practice would be a CP25, and everybody can appreciate 0 compliance violations on a status review. Our Farm Bill Biologist team is around to help accelerate enrollment into Farm Bill programs. We provide the technical assistance to landowners that are looking to do wildlife habitat creation and management, and do a variety of different outreach and educational things for USDA programs, as well with other nonprofit groups and our local chapters. And along with that, we're working with those other groups and partners that have different programs. So if somebody doesn't necessarily fit into those USDA categories, we can probably still help them or provide that assistance. Like I said, we have a team of 9 biologists across the state. We're full staffed. I think we've dropped this map in the chat the last couple of times, but if somebody doesn't have it, let us know and we can get you an updated copy of that to reach out to your folks. And with that, I'm going to just recap a little bit from the last presentation I did a month ago, just kind of set the stage again here. We have about 16 million acres of forest land in Wisconsin, or about 46%. I think that's a pretty interesting one. The most interesting stat I think I had was that forest land has been steadily increasing in Wisconsin since 1935, which doesn't mean all types of forests, but just in general it has been. And then of our forest land, about 84% of that is hardwood dominated, with the exception of the 2 large conifer areas, the Northwest Sands, kind of that Burnett, Washburn, Douglas area, and then the Central Stands, that Adams, Juneau, Portage, and probably a little bit of Jackson County there as well. I kind of ended the presentation last time with areas that are good for traditional tree plantings, those small fields or kind of that forested landscape where fields might already be overtaken by trees if we were to do grass plantings, or areas where the landowner's goals are predominantly timber production are good value areas to do tree plantings. And then I'm going to kick off today's topic with the myths of CRP is all weeds. I think we've done a pretty good job of debunking that one through our series already. But in the tree realm, the tree plantings are simple and inexpensive. And I'll just present today, and at the end we can decide whether or not that's a reality or a myth. Like any good conservation project, tree plantings need to start with a plan. And I would say probably more than other things, this plan is probably fairly important from the CRP side of things. Typically, we're working with our partners at DNR to develop these plans, and I would say it's important to involve them pretty early in the planning discussions so that they can lay out the expectations and criteria for that landowner, potentially even before they're signing up on the application process, if at all possible. The example on the left is just a job sheet or an implementation requirement from NRCS, or you might simply see the handwritten plan on the right from a DNR forester, just depending upon how they provide that to FSA or NRCS in the area. The first thing that we should probably be getting, whether it's coming from FSA or NRCS or DNR, is the area of interest for that tree planting. And then after that, hopefully we're kind of identifying the types of planting. I'm just going to kind of focus on the 2 main ones, the 3As and the 3s, so the hardwood plantings and the softwood plantings for today's calls. Whether it's a 22 or a 4D, the majority of the information that follows here will be very similar. A lot of these plantings are typically done on a set spacing, so your 8x8s or 8x7, somewhere between that 680 and 1,000 trees per acre. You know, those hardwood plantings needing to be at least 50%. So a lot of times we're putting in that 2/3 hardwoods, 1 row of conifer, so that we maintain that 50% at all times. The softwood plantings can be that 100% conifer, having those grass shrub openings, and again are typically planted on those spacings. After we've decided kind of the area and the type of planting that we're doing, we need to figure out what kind of material we're going to be planting. Most commonly done through CRP would be bare rootstock. So you're looking at like a 2-year-old started tree that was plucked from its location, and then it's going to be transplanted into the new location. You're usually averaging that 12 to 18 inches or larger. But there are some plantings or options that allow for direct seeding, which is taking the mast or the fruit from the tree itself and then replanting that directly onto the site. Once we know kind of what we're having, what species we're going to have, the areas, ordering is probably one of the biggest nightmares with tree plantings, I would say. And it's usually just because of the timeline on it. The most common place that I see orders coming from for bulk tree orders is probably the state nursery. DNR sales are typically starting in October, and they're pretty good for bulk orders, but they usually order in batches of 100. So they're typically cheapest for large plantings, but you're going to need to encourage your landowner to be early on this order process, as they do sell out of a lot of stock by midwinter. Another second place that we see a lot of trees and shrubs coming from, especially on the smaller scale plantings, 4Ds or just even some of the small 3s and 3As, would be the county tree and shrub sales. I say they're typically better for smaller plantings because they're being sold in bundles of 25 usually versus the large scale 100. And they're typically just reselling trees and shrubs from a private vendor, so cost and size can kind of vary depending upon what county you're ordering them from. The third common option would be the private nursery stock, and there is a lot of different nursery vendors in the state of Wisconsin and our surrounding states. I don't know of a great list that has them all on it, but if you go to the DNR's website, is a good place to send folks to. They keep a pretty inclusive list. It's not all inclusive, but it's a good place to start for landowners. They typically will have a little bit better availability for some of those odd species that DNR might sell out of right away. And their stock tends to be a little bit larger, which can have better survival rates, but it does come at a cost typically from ordering with those private nurseries. And probably the hardest one to order would be your seed stock if you are looking at that direct seeding of ordering just the bulk bushels of acorns or birch seed. There's not a ton of options around. The DNR does sell them from the state nursery. You can call some of the private vendors if they have additional leftover stock from what they were planting. They will sometimes sell it. But on this one, the availability of the seed is probably going to limit what species you're able to put into your planting, maybe more than what we would like to have from a diversity standpoint. Once the stock arrives, trees need to be planted pretty quickly, especially the bare root trees. You got a lot of flexibility on the seed, but bare root seedlings can't get dried out, and we don't want them to come out of dormancy before they're planted. So ideally, they're going to be kept in a cool, dark place, and they're going to want to be damp, not drenched. So ways that I've seen landowners work with this is placing wood chips down, spraying that with water, and then placing the roots of the trees in there. Smaller scale or small plantings, you can sometimes wrap paper towel around the roots that's wet, just put them inside a plastic bag to keep the moisture in there. If it's in an unheated basement or a garage, typically around that 40 degrees, up to 60 is okay for short periods of time. We can store them to about 1 to 2 weeks before they're planted. Any longer than that, we're probably looking at trying to heal them in or put them in a temporary planting location to replant them later. It's not real common for CRP, and it's not very ideal. From a cost sharing standpoint, it comes a little bit of a nightmare. So hopefully we can avoid that. Image on the right, those bags are filled with damp wood chips and the roots are in there. Those are being transported to a site for planting that day. So that's kind of an example of how folks can maintain those for a couple of weeks. Thinking about our prep, this one gets a little bit tricky. If it's cropland, usually we're going to go with no prep required from the timeline aspect, right? So tree plantings are typically going to be done in April or May in the spring of the year. And we don't usually, with Wisconsin winters, unlike this tropical one we're having this year, have the option to get a herbicide application on in the spring prior to planting. So most herbicide applications are done sometime in August to November, the fall prior to the planting, and the crops are typically on, so there's not a lot of weed residual there. If we're in kind of the idle sites or CRP conversions, those can require quite extensive prep between mowing, spraying, tilling, and there's a few different options of going about it, whether it's whole field management or like it's depicted on the top right there, where they're doing like strip tilling and spraying just for bare root seedlings. If they were going to dormant seed that, we would need exposed soil, or direct seed that, sorry, we would need exposed soil across the entire site to be able to have that seed contact on it. Once we get the site prepped and our stock comes in, there's the two planting methods. So the bare root planting method, you're starting with that 2-year-old stock. Like I mentioned before, it's typically planted in that 8x8 or 8x7, so that's 680 to about 1,000 trees per acre. Smaller plantings, you'll probably have a single species in a row. Larger plantings, you'll probably get mixed species within the row. So on that hardwood planting, you might have oaks and maples in the same row, and then you'll have your row of conifers that could have spruce and pine in the same row. They could be individual, but typically on those larger ones, they get mixed together. And then there's a couple different ways of doing the bare root plantings. There's the machine planted, or like that tree planter, the 3-point attachment, which was pictured in that last slide. Or you can look at like the hand planting. You can use a shovel, a tree spade, or the dibble bar that's pictured down on the bottom right. But no matter how you do it, you kind of got to use a little bit of caution. That picture on the top right shows some of the downfalls of tree planting there, I guess. There's a lot of different ways to plant a tree wrong and only a couple ways to plant it right. I would say the two most common ones that I see are air pockets, number 3 there, especially with hand planting. So if you look at that bottom left diagram, it shows kind of sticking the tree spade in, you wiggle it back and forth, shove the tree in the ground. Then you move it over a little bit, stick the tree spade in the ground, pull it back so you close the bottom of the hole first, and then push it back to close the top of the hole so there's no air gaps. And then J-root is another very common term you'll hear, which is basically the tree roots that came on that seedling are longer than the hole that the tree planter or the tree spade makes. So the roots turn around and actually come up towards the surface. The solution for that is you can actually trim the roots. Usually about 50% of the roots can be trimmed off before you run into too much problems. Hopefully you don't have to trim quite that much off to make those plantings work. On the direct seeding, you're starting with that seed versus the seedlings. So that's typically done in the fall, broadcast onto a well-prepared site. So you're hopefully going into a crop field or at least a exposed dirt on the site. And then they need to be cultipated or rolled after to press that seed into the ground. These can be a little more challenging just because they're slower to establish because you're not starting with a 2 or a 3-year-old tree. You're starting with the seed itself. And they tend to be more random. You know, there's not a nice, easy, clean row to go out and inspect. It's just a broadcasted seed. Some areas are going to be more dense than others, and it's not in even distribution. So it can be a little bit more challenging from a compliance standpoint. Once they're planted, we're not done quite yet. Trees are a little bit fussy those first couple years from a weed control standpoint. Most common, I would say, prescribed practice is probably mowing. On the bare root seedlings, you're looking at mowing between the rows in the first couple years. There's an example of that there on the right picture. Landowner just mowed 6 feet on each side of the trees, keep the competing vegetation down, not getting smothered out, sunlight's getting down to them. On the direct seedings, you're probably doing whole field mowings the first 2 years, the first year being that 8 to 10 inches. The second summer, you're mowing at that 12 to 16 inches, just trying to stay above the height of those trees. And then similar to our prairie plantings, in that third year, we hopefully have enough growth that we're not having to worry about the weed competition as much, and or we just can't mow high enough to stay above the trees. Alternative options, herbicide applications. So you do sometimes have the weeds get away. Can't tell where our trees rows are on the large scale plantings. We don't want to mow them off. There's options to do some broadcast spraying of selective herbicides after the trees have gone dormant in the fall or prior to them coming out of dormancy in the spring. I'm going to tell you to ask your forester about that, but a common product you'll hear is thymazine. And then on small scale products or small scale plantings, I've recommended this one a few times from foresters, is actually taking a stovepipe and then sliding it over the top of each individual tree and spraying about a 1 to 3 foot area with glyphosate around it to keep the competing vegetation down. Works well on those small plantings. That way you don't need to worry about mowing between the rows and mowing your trees off by accident. And then that's going to bring us to my series of downfalls, or I guess challenges with tree plantings. And I mentioned it in the last presentation, but 60% of a deer's diet is browse, so young woody material. And the average deer density in Wisconsin is about 20 deer per square mile, which is quite high actually. There's a few different options we have to keep them off our trees. There's deer repellents, plant skid deer off, but they're typically just a powdered mixture that you're spraying on your trees. They last a month to a couple months, and then they need to be reapplied for the first few years. More permanent option might be the browse protection. So you can look at tree tubes, mesh protectors, or bud caps. Start with the bottom one there, the bud caps. It's pictured on the bottom right. It's exclusively for conifer trees. Basically, it's a waxy note card that's folded over the terminal bud or the most vertical growing top bud on the pine tree and keeps the deer from eating it off. Needs to be reapplied for the first couple years, but they're extremely cheap options. That typically only works really well if your deer densities are under about 15 to 18 deer per square mile. So in the state of Wisconsin, we're kind of on the upper end of that, depending upon where you're at the state. So you might need to look at mesh protectors for your conifers or your shrub plantings, which are the bottom left picture. Come in various different diameters and heights, but typically if deer browse is a concern, we're putting on about a 4 to a 5 foot tall mesh protector or a tree tube. And then the last option there is the tree tubes, which are pictured on the top. And they're more of a solid tree tube. That's typically your hardwood plantings that are getting those. Once they're on, they're still not maintenance free. You get birds in the top of them, bird nests in them. We get our heavy wet winters and snows and they tip over. So they do require some maintenance going forward. Buying high quality ones, you can sometimes get 2 tree plantings out of a tube though if you reuse them. Downfall number 2 would be the weather implications. The last few summers we've had extreme drought, and that's kind of been detrimental to tree plantings. When you start talking about 700, 800, 1,000 trees per acre on a 10-acre planting, it's just not feasible to water them. So we do see a lot of mortality from drought. Flooding may be less common, but more on like the CP22 type sites where we're in those riparian zones and we're seeing some flooding out, or just maybe the wrong species was planted in a wet area. And then I lump survival in here. Anytime that you're transplanting something, there's just an inherent risk of some of them dying, and that's just part of tree plantings. We know we're going to have immortality of a percentage of the trees just from natural causes. And then there's pests. I have a whole list of them there: ash borer, blight, oak wilt. Some of those are predominantly on larger trees. There's some tip weevils, some needle cast, a bunch of different diseases and pests, and trees are susceptible to a lot of them. Some like older mature trees, some are more common on the plantings, and some don't discriminate between them all, but they are something to be aware of, I guess, going forward, that we are going to continue to have these, and it might dictate what species we're putting in plantings. We don't put ash in hardly any plantings anymore. You don't see a lot of other species being planted just because of the diseases that are affecting them as well. And then I would say downfall 4 is going to be costs. Your herbicide for tree planting tends to be a little bit more than just a glyphosate application. So you're looking at that $80 to $90 an acre. Your seedling cost, a pine tree from the DNR nursery is about 52 cents a piece. A hardwood tree is about 75 cents a piece. And if you go with private nursery stock, you can be up over $1 or $1.25 even sometimes on those. Installation costs, if you're paying somebody to come plant them, you're probably in that 20 to 30 cents a tree. And then weed and insect control, if you're doing that mowing and spraying after the planting, you're probably in that $75 to $100 an acre on that, with an estimated cost of about $500 to $600 per acre just to get your trees in the ground. And that doesn't include any browse protection. So say you want to put tree tubes on 50% of your hardwood planting, about another $2,000 per acre that you're going to be expending to do that. So it can get quite expensive quite quickly. But if it's all done correctly, we end up having a pretty fully stocked forest that's providing water quality benefits, carbon sequestering, wildlife habitat, and hopefully timber products into the future. So I will leave it with that for you to tell me whether or not we busted the myth that trees are simple and inexpensive to plant, and I'll open it for questions. If no one's got a question, I want to know how many times Jesse appeared in the presentation.
I think twice.
That's incorrect.
Not enough times.
Challenge accepted.
Someone guessed 4. Is that right?
3 is the correct answer.
So I guess I have a question. How do you talk to landowners who want to do trees and, given the difficulty of it, if they're adamant for it, but the deer browse is going to be an issue, how do you approach that?
You just have to be brutally honest with them. Laying out numbers can sometimes make a big difference with landowners. And then, like I mentioned, getting them in touch with us or the forester ahead of time to have that conversation, showing them sites or photos. It's not easy because there are those people that are just adamant on planting trees, and it's hard to get around. But I think I try and honestly sell them on the benefits of grass and how fast they can get that established and how we can get different wildlife habitat through that, and that trees aren't the limiting factor on their landscape. Does it always work? No, but I'll take the wins I can get.
And I think too, I think you made a good point in the one slide about how tree orders for especially the DNR open up in like October. Because I think a lot of producers who are not great planners, like they come into the office, they want to sign up for CRP and they want to start in a couple months and like plant this spring. And if they don't think that through, then their costs are going to be exponentially higher because they're not going to be able to get them from the DNR. We've ran into that before. So that's a really good thing to convey to them, that like we need really good planning ahead if we are going to do trees too.
Then you sell them on grass because I can get that seed tomorrow.
That's true too.
I would add on tree planting as well. If anyone has looked at oak savanna tree plantings under rare and declining habitat, that does have a requirement of that tree being a minimum of 3 feet tall, and that is to ensure it is at a appropriate size to handle a management activity of burning in year 6. So those especially need to be planned ahead because there are very few places that sell 3-foot tall oak trees. I think only one out of Michigan that I've frequently heard about. So, planning in general is very important when it comes to trees.
Cody, are you able to see your chat?
Yeah, I see it.
Go ahead and read that one. Answer it for us.
Do you have an opinion on NRCS programs for tree plantings rather than enrolling tree practices with CRP? I don't know that I have a great opinion on it. Cost sharing might be slightly better in NRCS programs because most of our tree practices that I'm enrolling anyways are going through the general where they're only receiving 50% cost share versus the higher cost share rate in the NRCS options. But then you're not looking at the rental option as in rental payments included with that either. I've done a lot of like the 4D or just like a small shrub planting associated with CRP grass plantings through Equip, just because I wasn't able to get them in through continuous and I didn't want to wait for a general on it.
I think as Cody kind of alluded to, one of the biggest things is what that producer kind of wants. One of the benefits of CRP is that, especially for softwood tree planting, you could enroll, through indefinitely, assuming compliance. Hardwood trees, you're limited to 30 years, but that's, 30 years of annual rental payments you would get. On the other side of that same thing is you have to follow federal program policy and regulations for those 30 years or however long you're enrolled into it. Where at NRCS, you could kind of plant it and, be done dealing with us. So, it's whatever that producer is looking for, both in the short term and long term.
And I would just mention too, like tax implication is a good thing to look at too, because like being in a longer term program like CRP where it's taxed as ag, where I think NRCS programs, they're shorter term and there's a little bit more, I guess, mystery into what that does with taxes after it's not under contract anymore.
I'm not going to provide tax advice, but look at tax law 18. Basically, it says any of the USDA programs remain ag tax during the duration of that program. So shorter lifespan though than a 10-year contract typically.
Any other questions out there? All right, then I guess we will wrap up for today. Thank you, Cody, for the presentation. And have a wonderful day, everybody.